Enterprise architecture has actually been out there for 20 to 25 years as a practice and as a discipline. But if you ask 10 people in any company, to define or describe what enterprise architecture is, in reality, you're probably going to get 10 different definitions. Anything from a technical architecture function to a business relationship to an IT strategy function. And so, in reality, there's a lot of different ways to run enterprise architecture, but what becomes very important is for you to define for your company what is the scope, what is the scale of your enterprise architecture organization, and make sure that they've got the clarity across the organization of what is expected and what the outcome from that EA team is. Too many of the failures that I've seen or been a part of have been startup, small group, low in the organization, and not a clear understanding of what was expected of that team. Another challenge with enterprise architecture teams really comes down to the structure and the staffing. You've got to make sure that from an enterprise architecture, it's placed well within the organization so that it can be a part of the planning process. And it's also going to require some of your best and your brightest. And those best and brightest that have leadership capabilities, technical capabilities, and business relationship management capabilities, highly coveted resources in your development organizations and in your engineering organizations. And so you have to make a conscious decision that if you're going to support the concept of enterprise architecture, you're going to dedicate the right number of people and the right skill sets to those organizations to allow them to be successful. From an alignment perspective, this goes to both IT as well as the business. And it's important to have support and sponsorship from your CIO. That's always important. But what I've found is in order to really be effective in enterprise architecture, I like to tie myself to the money. And I like to make sure that I'm a part of the key decisions that are being made about how we're going to spend IT assets and resources. And so making relationships and getting sponsorship from your CFO, from your procurement organizations, and ideally from the rest of your executive leadership team to engender the importance of this role and the importance of how it plays in the capital planning processes and in the overall strategy for your company as it relates to your technology. And then finally, it's value. Again, enterprise architecture has so many failures out there, in my opinion, because you see so many times people are starting up enterprise architecture teams. They're very expensive resources, typically, and they're doing a lot of work, but what is the value that you're getting out of that organization? And the value prop is great to be able to maximize how you're making those investments for both short-term and long-term, but how do you as an organization make sure that you're actually realizing those benefits on the back end, and not only realizing them, but also communicating them throughout your organization and IT and the business as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kimberly.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So my definition of enterprise architecture is a way to describe where you are today, where you want to be in the future, might be 5 years from now, 3 years from now, and how you're going to get there. And one of the breakthroughs, I think, in enterprise architecture has been using it as really part of your transformational capabilities in getting from here to there. What I would say is that it's really essential for enterprise architecture practices to be coupled, closely coupled with the enterprise's strategic planning and execution activities. Okay, they're not meant to be separate activities. And I think that it's really sort of key to an organization's viability, how it handles transformation. Enterprise architecture gives you methods and best practices that can be applied to your strategic execution. Another breakthrough in enterprise architecture is moving beyond the real focus on IT and how does IT connect to the business, to really breaking down the functions, the lines of business in your organization, finding the same kinds of business functions in one unit and another unit, being able to model those and then provide the supporting IT, the foundation, so to speak. And then the third breakthrough that I call attention to is really in the frameworks that are used. Brian Cameron, the fellow that was going to be with us from Penn State University, runs enterprise architecture practice there, and they've got a study that they've sort of in the initial phase of, but it's finding that a lot of organizations are using hybrid approaches in their enterprise architecture. So in doing some of the research myself, we're a very small agency and very strapped for cash. So a pragmatic enterprise framework was something that I was looking for. And sure enough, it seems to be just the right pill for an organization that really doesn't have the tolerance for complex frameworks that include lots of different models and levels and that sort of thing. So those are a couple of the breakthroughs that I'd have you think about.
That's great. So first of all, my name is Michele Iacovone, which is spelled just the way it's pronounced, if you're Italian. So I'm just going to throw you a little bit of a lifeline. You can call me Michael if Michele is too hard. So I was actually kind of struggling a little bit with this topic, which was what are the emerging technologies, tools, and frameworks that have potential for EA. And I think I was struggling on two fronts. One, there's a context of EA that I wanted to walk you through. And the second one was, because especially as we look at tools and frameworks, and after scratching my head a little bit, there really isn't a whole lot of innovation, and I just wanted to frame that up. But I think the context is important. And I think, as part of our discipline, we live in a little bit of this dilemma or paradox where if we're doing our job really well, people really don't know that EA is being done, because it's being done in the context of the strategic decisions, the business outcomes that the business is driving, right? And so the better we do this job in some ways, the less the value is apparent. And so when we talk about disruptive technologies, it's really about what are the disruptive emerging technologies, not for EA, but for the business. And so I've listed a few here. Of course, the Gartners and the Forresters and all have much more comprehensive lists. And what we have there is also some of the ones that we're really currently applying at Intuit today. And so things like public cloud and network effects are very top of mind because we think they're going to be transformative for us. And so as we then take this and try to apply the tools and the frameworks, I really like to think of this in terms of the front office and the back office. And so the tools that we apply from an EA perspective, whether they're collaboration tools, EA portfolio management tools, software design tools, they're all things, and the frameworks that go along with it. We, by the way, have kind of standardized on a variant of the pragmatic framework at Intuit, are all things that really help you do the back office work. And then all of the work really has to be, you have to translate that into the language of the company, into the language of the culture. And so you have to think about strategy, the operating mechanisms, the processes that exist within the company, the metrics, the KPI, the finances, and then ultimately the culture, the way in which you communicate, you build relationships in ways that are socially advantaged in your company. And then translate all of that into what are the business outcomes that the company is really cares about and where they're really focused. And these are just some of the ones that are top of mind for us here at Intuit.
Great, Michele. What I will talk about is around EA tools in more detail. One of the things that has been happening is, even with the discipline of enterprise architecture, the move from more of an IT-centric kind of approach to business-centric has definitely been happening, right? So a lot more in terms of business focus, business outcomes, and so on and so forth. I view enterprise architecture as a mechanism where constraints are imposed that deconstrain how the overall business is moving. And so whenever you talk about constraints, I almost look at it as brakes on a car. It makes it go faster. That's why you have brakes. And think about that, right? And the idea is that even when you talk about constraints and how do you all start to think the same way and have the same vocabulary across the board. And that's where some of these tools start to take effect. And usually when you talk about tools, you have a notion of, hey, here, what is Forrester talking about it? What is Gartner talking about it? So the latest Wave report and the Magic Quadrant are up there. I'm not going to delve into any of the tools that are represented there. But typically, the tools that you want to look at are elements that obviously have a notion of business outcomes in mind. Too many tools in the past have focused on what the IT outcomes are, and that's not necessarily useful or impactful in the end. Clearly, there's a notion of a repository, a notion of modeling. Do you have a mechanism to do gap and impact analysis? Because the idea is that if you have a common vocabulary, you're making some perturbances to the enterprise architecture, what really is going to impact? It's a very important thing to consider. And then the usual aspects of administration, configuration. Can I visualize my roadmaps? Can I visualize them easily? And so on and so forth. So a variety of tools have emerged over the last several years. And this notion of a quadrant or a wave in terms of what is the best tool or what is the most visionary or more execution-oriented tool has definitely changed over the years. In fact, you would see that Gartner's Magic Quadrant from last year looks extremely different from the one that came out in October of 2013 also. So the overall cautions that I've seen, and I've been the user of many of these tools, but the real issue certainly comes down to, first of all, there's a notion of boil the ocean that Eric Schmidt talked about, right? So you can start with a tool and you can say that, hey, this is going to help me improve the maturity of my overall EA practice. Quite far from the case, right? And we all learn by going the wrong way. In terms of, you say, hey, let me get a tool in, I'm sure it's going to solve my world hunger problem, right? Not quite. You need to have a certain level of maturity before you can get to even the tools being impactful, right? And so the one aspect of, is the tool holistic enough, is a double-edged sword in a certain way, right? You have to start with, okay, can I have it cover the business architecture aspect of it through the application architecture, the information architecture, the technology, all of that? Is it holistic enough? But there are lots of tools which are very, very siloed. So you got to ask a question of what are you really going for? There's a huge learning curve to several of these tools. But again, if you're a mature enough EA organization, then it makes sense to invest in such a tool. Typically, some of these tools require buy-in across the organization and the processes. In terms of, these could obviously you could start with something, but very swiftly you could see all the artifacts become obsolete very soon because it's not being used. And it's more of shelfware. And then the last part is sustained efforts need to be, you need to actually work at it. So again, definitely the notion of EA tools moving from IT-centric to business-centric is very much the case. You do find people using things like Visio and spreadsheets and all kinds of other artifacts and artifact-making mechanisms to do that. There are points where you can get to maybe 2 years into an enterprise architecture program, you can start to look at these tools, not before that. Okay.
So we're a consumer products company. We make very high margin products. We started out as a physical company, that is making a physical product. People drew on paper, and they produced things through chemical processes, were then shipped by truck to a cinema and shown on a physical projector. We were very lucky, however, because we made a complete transition to a digital world very early, so before the turn of the century. So what I'll describe next is really our transition from that position to where we are today through enterprise architecture, but also point out our latest transition and what worked and what didn't work. So first of all, we started in 2000 with about 1,100 artists in the business. We're a company of about 2,500 employees. We were making one movie every other year. Today, we have 1,100 artists. We are making 3 movies every year. And with this latest transition, we'll probably take 20 to 25% of the cost out of every one of those movies. So that's the business problem that we faced to solve with enterprise architecture. I would say we went through 2 phases. The first one was essentially infrastructure as a service. So our ability to put any artist on any product at any time, at any location, using any processor, was a critical scaling characteristic that allowed us to increase our output at the same cost. To organize that, we used infrastructure techniques. So enterprise architecture to us at that stage meant caching, networking, storage, processing, and ultimately the cloud in around 2003. So as a success story, architecting infrastructure to deliver a business outcome, I think we've all had that success. Struck by one of my colleagues here mentioning the front office and the back office. 90% of our resources are focused on the front office. 10% are focused on the back office. We're a small company. However, one of the lessons we learned in this latest transition is there is no such thing as a back office anymore. When you talk about mobility or bring your own device, really these are the techniques of the front office, of the consumer, coming right into the heart of the enterprise. So our last transition, really, over the last 5 years, has been really for what I would describe as an infrastructure as a service to a platform as a service, where our goal was to move data to the processors regardless of the scale of that data, the scale of the problem. So in other words, we have elastic compute, elastic storage, able to sort of put both storage and compute at the point of an individual's consumption. So a single artist in our business might command 5,000 compute cores and be operating over tens of terabytes of data every day. To be able to sort of move that data around and to deal with a global organization with high latency connectivity required more than just infrastructure. We don't have enough money to spend on the infrastructure to make that work. We had to essentially establish a data platform, the integrated single platform in which all applications would run. That sounds like an archetypal target for enterprise architecture. All the tools, all the enterprise architects, all the traditional techniques abjectly failed. The scale was too large. The governance practices, the idea that you actually understand what the business impact is and you can describe it, none of that actually worked. In the end, the only thing that worked was to draw our inspiration from the architectures and techniques of the internet, the public internet. So essentially, we brought the internet inside the organization, and each one of our consumers now, each one of our users, is interacting with the data platform essentially as a consumer. So it's HTTP protocols, it's sort of NoSQL databases and sort of blob stores, and a governance structure which really would probably make most EA architects sort of turn in their graves. Because it needs to move fast, the applications change every day, the usage patterns change every day. That model is robust enough and scalable enough to actually make this sort of transition for what is effectively a high-performance computing unit. Just to give you a conclusion in terms of the scale we're operating at, it's about 1 billion transactions a second. As I said, it's in terms of change management, it's multiple tens of terabytes a day. A movie is about 500 million files, and we have 10 in production at any given time. So were we moving ordinary documents around in a traditional business, we would have about 2 million employees spread across the globe. So it's a very large-scale data organization, even though it's very concentrated in terms of creating images. So my conclusion is I got very little out of the enterprise architecture literature. I got absolutely nothing out of the tools and frameworks. They do not scale sufficiently for today's sort of data-oriented architecture. And the best I could draw on was essentially the Zyngas and the Facebooks and these sort of thin client, large-scale solutions that today are dealing with consumers, but tomorrow will be dealing with your employees.